In this video, summer relationships cannot be bound by the chains of time. Love always finds its own way, even if 300 years must pass. In this video, you will witness a story that proves this truth.
The mark of the forgotten. The rain had been falling for 7 days straight over the kingdom of Valdren, turning the ancient cobblestone streets into rivers of silver and shadow. In the highest tower of the obsidian castle, King Alaric Voss stood alone by a window that had not been opened in 300 years, watching the water trace paths down glass that was older than most human family trees. His pale fingers rested against the cold surface, and if anyone had been brave enough to look closely, they might have noticed something peculiar. The way his reflection seemed just a fraction slower than his movements, as if even the mirror was afraid to keep up with him. Alaric had ruled this kingdom since before the Great Plague, before the burning of the old libraries, before humans had forgotten that vampires once walked among them not as monsters, but as guardians. Now they only remembered the fear. Now they only told stories of blood and darkness. And perhaps, Alaric thought with a weariness that pressed against his centuries-old bones, perhaps that was what he deserved. His council had gathered that morning with troubling news. A group of human refugees had been discovered in the eastern woods, 37 of them, including women and children, fleeing from a famine that had swallowed their homeland across the mountains. His generals wanted them removed. His advisors wanted them imprisoned. But Alaric had given a different order, one that had silenced the entire throne room with its unexpectedness. Bring them inside the walls, he had commanded. Give them shelter in the eastern quarter, feed them. The silence that followed had been thick enough to suffocate, and Alaric had seen the questions burning in his council's eyes. Why would the vampire king, the creature humans whispered about in terrified prayers, show mercy to those who would drive a stake through his heart if given the chance? But none of them dared to ask. None of them ever did. The truth was something Alaric carried alone, locked in a chamber of his heart that even immortality could not access. He remembered a time when he was not a king, when he was not even a vampire. He remembered warmth. He remembered sunlight on his skin without pain. He remembered a family. But those memories had faded over the centuries like old paintings left too long in the rain, their colors bleeding into something unrecognizable. What remained was a single image, a woman's hand reaching for him, and a promise he could no longer recall the words to, only the weight of it in his chest. By the third night after the refugees' arrival, Alaric found himself walking through the eastern quarter in disguise. He had traded his royal black cloak for a simple gray traveling coat, and he had pulled a hood low over his features. His guards thought he was resting in his chambers. His council thought he was reviewing ancient treaties. But Alaric had learned long ago that the only way to truly understand his kingdom was to walk through it as a ghost, unseen, unrecognized, unburdened by the terror his name inspired. The refugee camp had transformed a section of abandoned merchant houses into something almost resembling a village. Fires burned in old hearths that had not seen warmth in decades. Clothes hung from lines strung between windows, and everywhere there were the sounds of human life, conversations, arguments, laughter, crying. It was chaotic and messy and desperately, achingly alive in a way that made something twist painfully beneath Alaric's ribs. He moved through the narrow alleys like smoke, observing without being observed. He watched a young mother trying to comfort a sick infant, her own hunger evident in the hollows of her cheeks. He watched old men sharing stories around a fire, their words carrying the accent of a homeland they would likely never see again. He watched children playing with sticks and stones, their imaginations transforming rubble into castles and broken crates into sailing ships. It was near one of these groups of children that Alaric paused, his attention caught by a small figure sitting alone on a stone step. She could not have been more than 6 years old. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, a deep reddish brown that caught the firelight and held it like a secret. Her clothes were patched and worn, clearly handed down through multiple owners before reaching her, but what struck Alaric most was her stillness. While other children ran and shouted and tumbled over each other in the carefree chaos of youth, this little girl sat perfectly motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something that only she could see. Alaric knew that look. He had worn it himself once in the terrible weeks after his transformation when he had sat in the darkness of a cave and tried to remember how to breathe without needing to. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. Against his better judgment, against 3 centuries of carefully maintained distance from the human world, Alaric found himself moving toward her. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to frighten her, and lowered himself to sit on a nearby crate. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the camp continued around them, but here in this small pocket of shadow, there was only the crackle of distant fires and the whisper of rain beginning to fall once more. "You are not with the other children," Alaric said finally, keeping his voice soft. The girl did not look at him. "They want to play war games," she said, her voice carrying a strange old quality that did not match her young face. "I don't like war games. My mama said war isn't a game. She said it takes things away and never gives them back." Alaric felt something crack in the ice around his heart. "Your mother sounds very wise." "Oh, she was. Was the past tense hung in the air between them, heavy with grief too large for such small shoulders to carry. "I'm sorry," Alaric said, and he meant it with every fragment of his ancient, weary soul. "Losing someone we love is the hardest thing in any world, human or otherwise." For the first time, the girl turned to look at him. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, like spring leaves after rain, and there was an intelligence in them that made Alaric's breath catch. She studied him for a long moment, the way one might study a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit together. "Oh, you're sad too," she said. "It was not a question." Alaric blinked. In 300 years, no one, not his council, not his generals, not even the ancient vampires who had turned him, had ever looked past his power to see the man beneath it. And here was this tiny human child, peering into him as if his heart were made of glass. "Yes," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "I suppose I am." The girl nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already known. Then, without warning, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were so small, so fragile, so impossibly warm against his cold skin. Alaric froze, every muscle in his immortal body going rigid with shock. When was the last time someone had touched him without fear? He could not remember. "My name is Elara," the girl said. "My papa told me that when you're sad, you should hold someone's hand. He said it reminds you that you're not alone in the dark." Alaric's throat tightened. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man in the whole world," Elara said, and her voice trembled just slightly, the first crack in her remarkable composure. "He used to tell me stories about brave knights and kind monsters," and she stopped abruptly, her green eyes widening. Oh, she was staring at his wrist. Alaric followed her gaze and realized with a jolt that his sleeve had ridden up when she took his hand, exposing a small portion of his forearm. And there, visible against his pale skin, was the edge of a tattoo, an intricate design of a wolf's head surrounded by 7 stars, the ancient mark of the Valdren Guard, a brotherhood of warriors that had been disbanded 200 years ago. Alaric moved to pull his sleeve down, but Alara's grip on his hand tightened. "My papa had that same tattoo," she whispered, her voice filled with something between wonder and confusion. "Exactly the same, on the same spot. He said it was from when he was a soldier before I was born." The world seemed to stop. Alaric's mind raced backward through centuries of memory, searching, grasping, trying to make connections that should not exist. The Valdren Guard had been disbanded in his early reign. He had disbanded them himself after the blood betrayal, when half of them had turned against the other half in a civil war that had nearly destroyed the kingdom. The surviving members had scattered to the winds, some remaining as vampires, others had been human. The soldiers who had served before the Great Transformation, when the Guard had accepted both kinds. But that was 200 years ago. No human from that era could possibly still be alive, let alone have fathered a child who was sitting before him now. "Unless—" "Elara," Alaric said, and he was amazed that his voice remained steady when everything inside him was trembling. "What was your father's name?" The girl looked up at him with those impossibly green eyes. eyes that, now that he was truly looking, held a color he had seen only once before in his long existence. His name was Marcus, she said. Marcus Ashwood. He told me that our family has been around for a very long time. He said we carry something special in our blood, something that makes us live longer than other people, but not forever. She paused, tilting her head. He said one day someone might come looking for us, someone from the old kingdom. Alaric could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything except stare at this child as 300 years of grief and guilt and desperate, aching hope came crashing down around him. Marcus Ashwood. The name echoed through the corridors of his memory like a ghost finally finding its way home. Marcus Ashwood, his lieutenant, his friend, the only human who had ever known the truth about the king's transformation. The man who had helped Alaric through the darkest nights of his early immortality, who had sworn an oath of secrecy and loyalty that should have been impossible for a mortal to keep. The man who had disappeared the night of the blood betrayal, leaving behind only a letter that said, "I will keep my promise. I will keep your bloodline safe, even if you cannot remember it." Alaric had never understood those words. He had assumed Marcus had died like so many others, another casualty of a war that should never have happened. But now, looking into the green eyes of this little girl, eyes the exact same shade as his own had been, before the transformation stole all color from them, Alaric felt something impossible taking shape in his chest. Your bloodline. His hand trembled as he reached out very slowly and brushed a strand of autumn-colored hair away from Elara's face. Elara, he said, his voice breaking on her name, do you know what your father was protecting? The girl shook her head. He never told me. He said when the time was right, I would understand. He said, her voice caught, and for the first time, tears began to slip down her cheeks. He said that when I found the person with the same tattoo, I should tell them 3 words. He made me memorize them. He said they would know what it meant. Alaric's heart, his ancient, supposedly dead heart, was pounding against his ribs like a drum. What words, Elara? She looked up at him, this tiny, fragile, impossibly important child, and spoke in a whisper that shattered 3 centuries of loneliness. The wolf remembers. And in that moment, standing in the rain-soaked shadows of a refugee camp, the vampire king, the most feared creature in 7 kingdoms, felt something he had not felt since the day he died as a human and rose as something else. Well, he remembered. He remembered a wife with autumn hair. He remembered a child in her arms, a son with green eyes born 3 days before the attack that would change everything. He remembered begging Marcus to take them somewhere safe, to hide them from the enemies who would use them against him. He remembered the transformation stealing those memories like a thief in the night, leaving only fragments, only shadows, only the aching sense that he had lost something precious. His son, his family, his bloodline. They had survived. Over 200 years, they had survived. And now, standing before him with tears on her cheeks and trust in her eyes, was his great-great-great-granddaughter, the last living connection to the man he had been before the darkness claimed him. Alaric Voss, the vampire king, fell to his knees in the mud and wept the weight of centuries. The night after Alaric discovered the truth about Elara, he did not return to his castle. Instead, he sat in the shadows of the refugee quarter until dawn threatened the horizon, watching over the small house where the little girl slept. His guards would be searching for him by now. His council would be sending messengers to every corner of the kingdom. The vampire king had never simply vanished before, not in 300 years of rule. But Alaric could not bring himself to care. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, not just Alara's, but the face she reminded him of, his wife Seraphina. The memories were returning now, slowly at first, like water seeping through cracks in a dam, the sound of her laughter, the way she would tuck her autumn hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the warmth of her hand in his, back when his hand still carried warmth. He remembered the night his son was born, a tiny, perfect creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes like spring leaves. They had named him Cashin. Alaric had held him for exactly 6 hours and 23 minutes before the attack came, before the ancient vampire who had been hunting him finally found his hiding place and forced the transformation upon him with a bite that burned like liquid fire. The agony of turning had lasted 3 days. When Alaric finally woke, he was something else, something cold, something hungry, and the memories of his human life had faded like morning mist, leaving only fragments too painful to examine. He had assumed Serafina and Cassian were dead. He had assumed there was nothing left to save. But Marcus, loyal, brave, impossible Marcus, had taken them, had hidden them, had protected Alaric's bloodline across centuries, generation after generation, carrying a secret that should have died with him but somehow did not. "Oh, you're still here." The small voice made Alaric turn. Elara stood in the doorway of the house, wrapped in a blanket that was too large for her thin frame. The first gray light of pre-dawn touched her face, making her look almost ethereal. "I did not want you to be alone," Alaric said, the honesty coming easier now. "After everything you told me." Elara studied him with those old soul eyes. "You were crying last night. I've never seen a grown-up cry like that." "I have not cried in a very long time," Alaric admitted. "I had forgotten I still could." The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. Then she walked toward him, her bare feet making soft sounds on the wet stone, and sat down beside him on the step. She did not seem to notice the cold. She did not seem afraid of him. She simply sat there, a small, warm presence against the chill of the approaching dawn. "My papa cried sometimes," she said. "When he thought I was sleeping, I could hear him through the walls. He would say names I didn't recognize. He would say, 'I'm sorry,' over and over like he was talking to ghosts." Alaric's chest tightened. "Do you remember any of the names?" Elara thought for a moment. "Serafina, he said that one a lot, and Cassian, he would say, 'I kept my promise, Cassian, I kept them all safe.'" The names hit Alaric like physical blows. His wife, his son. Marcus had been talking to them across the years, carrying the weight of a vow that had outlasted generations. "Elara," Alaric said carefully, "I need to tell you something, something that might be difficult to understand." She looked up at him, patient and waiting. But before he could speak, a commotion erupted from the main square of the refugee quarter. Shouts, running footsteps, the clang of metal against metal. Alaric was on his feet in an instant, his senses expanding outward to identify the threat. Soldiers, not his soldiers. He knew every member of his army by the sound of their heartbeats. These were strangers, and they were moving with the organized precision of trained killers. "Stay here," Alaric commanded, and for a moment the full authority of the vampire king rang through his voice. Elara shrank back, her eyes wide with sudden fear. Alaric realized his mistake immediately. He had let the mask slip. He had shown her, even for a second, the predator that lived beneath his careful human disguise. "Please," he said, softening his voice with effort. "I need you to stay hidden. Can you do that for me?" Elara nodded, though her lower lip trembled. Alaric pulled his hood up and moved toward the source of the commotion, his footsteps making no sound on the wet stones. He found the main square transformed into a scene of chaos. 20 soldiers in foreign armor, crimson and gold, the colors of the Marchetti Empire from across the eastern mountains, had surrounded a group of refugees. Their swords were drawn. Their faces were hard with the look of men who had stopped seeing other humans as people. "Where is she?" The commander was shouting, his blade pressed against the throat of an elderly man. "The girl with the autumn hair, we know she fled here with the refugees." Alaric's blood turned to ice. They were looking for Elara. The commander was a tall man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much death to be troubled by causing more. His name, Alaric would later learn, was General Corvino, and he had been hunting the Ashwood bloodline for 15 years under orders from someone far more powerful than any human emperor. But in this moment, all Alaric knew was that this man intended to harm his granddaughter, his family, and something ancient and terrible awakened in the depths of his chest. Well, he stepped out of the shadows. The effect was immediate. Every soldier in the square turned toward him, their weapons rising instinctively. But Alaric did not draw a sword, he did not bare his fangs. He simply walked forward, each step measured and deliberate until he stood between the general and the terrified refugees. "You are in my kingdom," Alaric said, and his voice was soft, dangerously soft. "You have entered without permission. You have drawn weapons against people under my protection, and now you threaten a child." General Corvino studied him with the practiced eye of a man who had faced many opponents. "And who are you to make demands? Some local lord playing hero." Alaric lowered his hood. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The soldiers who had been stationed in this region knew his face. It was carved into the stone above the city gates, painted in the halls of every noble house, whispered about in prayers and curses alike. Even the foreign soldiers recognized what they were seeing, if only from legends they had dismissed as fairy tales. "Gods above," one of them whispered, stumbling backward. "It's him, it's the Vampire King," General Corvino finished, and to his credit, his voice did not shake. But his grip on his sword tightened, and Alaric could hear his heartbeat accelerating with the distinctive rhythm of barely controlled fear. "So the stories are true. Valdren is ruled by a monster." "Monster is a matter of perspective," Alaric said calmly. "I have ruled this kingdom for 300 years. I have protected its people, human and vampire alike, through plagues, famines, wars, and disasters. I have given shelter to refugees that your empire left to starve. Tell me, General, which of us deserves that title?" Corvino's jaw tightened. "I have my orders. The girl is to be retrieved at any cost. She carries something in her blood, something ancient, something powerful, something that belongs to my master." "Your master," Alaric repeated, and now his voice carried an edge of genuine curiosity. "And who might that be?" The general hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alaric saw something unexpected. Fear. Not fear of Alaric himself, but fear of whoever waited at the end of this chain of command. "You don't know what you're protecting," Corvino said finally. "That child, she's not just some refugee orphan. She's the last of a bloodline that should have died out centuries ago. A bloodline that threatens everything my master has built." "And what bloodline would that be?" Corvino smiled, a cold, terrible smile. "Yours, King Alaric, she carries your blood, your human blood, preserved across generations through some miracle we don't understand. And as long as she lives, you can never become what my master needs you to be." The world seemed to tilt beneath Alaric's feet. Someone knew, someone had known the truth about his bloodline all along, had been hunting it, trying to eliminate it for centuries. The attack that had forced his transformation, the enemies that had driven him into hiding, the night the ancient vampire had found him and changed him forever. None of it had been coincidence. "Who is your master?" Alaric demanded, and now his voice shook with something far more dangerous than anger. But before Corvino could answer, an arrow pierced his throat from behind. The general crumpled, his eyes wide with surprise, and behind him stood a figure in a dark cloak, a figure Alaric recognized immediately. Lord Verk, his oldest advisor, his most trusted vampire lord. The one who had stood at his side for 250 years. "My apologies, Your Majesty," Verk said smoothly, lowering the crossbow. "I could not allow him to reveal too much. Some secrets are better kept, buried." Alaric stared at his advisor, at the man he had trusted with the running of his kingdom, with the safety of his people, with matters he had shared with no one else. And for the first time, he saw the truth hiding behind those ancient, amber eyes. "It was you," Alaric whispered. "All along, you were the one who sent the vampire to transform me. You were the one who has been hunting my bloodline." Verk smiled, the same cold smile the general had worn, but infinitely more terrible coming from a face Alaric had trusted for centuries. "You were supposed to forget them completely," Verk said, genuine regret coloring his voice. "The transformation usually destroys all human attachments, but you kept fighting, you kept searching. That foolish human soldier, Marcus, he saw me that night. He knew what I had done, so he took your family and ran, and he hid them so well that even I could not find them." Why, the word tore from Alaric's throat. Why destroy my family? Why take everything from me? Verk's expression shifted into something almost resembling pity. Because a vampire king with human ties is a weak king. A king who remembers love will always be limited by it. I needed you to become something greater, something unbound by mortal emotions. I needed you to become a ruler who could lead our kind into a new era. He paused. But you never did. 300 years and you still protect humans, you still show mercy, you still feel, and now I understand why. He gestured toward the house where Elara was hiding. As long as your bloodline exists, some part of you will always remain human. Some part of you will always be weak. Alaric felt something shifting inside him, something old and dark and more powerful than anything he had accessed in centuries. His vision sharpened, his senses expanded. The ancient magic that came with his transformation, the power he had always held back, always controlled, always refused to unleash. It was rising now, rising in response to the threat against his family. You should not have come here, Verk, Alaric said, and his voice no longer sounded entirely human. You should not have touched my people. You should not have threatened my blood. Verk's confident expression flickered. Alaric, you wanted me to become a monster, the vampire king said, and shadows began gathering around him like living things responding to his rage. Be careful what you wish for. But before either of them could move, a small voice cut through the tension like a blade. Please don't. Elara stood at the edge of the square, her blanket clutched around her shoulders, tears streaming down her face. She was looking at Alaric not with fear, but with something far more devastating. Disappointment. My papa said the person with the tattoo was a good person, she whispered. He said when the wolf remembers, it remembers kindness. Not this, please, don't become what they want you to be. Alaric froze, the shadows still swirling around him, his power balanced on a knife's edge between protection and destruction. And in that moment, he had to choose. The monster that Verk had spent 3 centuries trying to create, or the man his granddaughter believed he could still be the wolf remembers. The shadows hung suspended in the air like breath held before a scream. Alaric stood motionless, his ancient power crackling around him, capable of destroying Verk and his soldiers in the space of a heartbeat. Every instinct forged across 3 centuries of survival was screaming at him to strike first, to eliminate the threat, to protect his bloodline with the only language his enemies understood. But Alara's words had found the crack in his armor, the small, fragile place where the man he used to be still lived. Don't become what they want you to be. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric released the darkness. It drained away from him like water receding from a shore, leaving him standing in the gray morning light as nothing more than a man. Immortal, yes, powerful, yes, but in this moment, choosing to be something other than a weapon. Verk's eyes widened with disbelief. What are you doing? This is your chance. Take your revenge. Take the power that has always been your right. That is exactly what you want, Alaric said quietly. You spent 300 years trying to destroy my humanity. Every manipulation, every scheme, every tragedy you engineered, it was all designed to push me toward becoming a king ruled by rage and hunger. A king you could eventually control. He turned to face Verk fully, and though there was no supernatural power in his gaze now, there was something far more unsettling, complete and utter clarity. But I remember now, Verk. I remember all of it. I remember who I was before you took everything from me. I remember the man who swore to protect this kingdom not through fear, but through justice. I remember the husband who held his wife's hand through the long nights. I remember the father who held his newborn son and promised him that the world would be better because of what they would build together. Alaric took a step forward, and Verk, ancient, powerful Lord Verk, took a step back. You cannot defeat me in direct combat, Verk said, but his voice had lost its confidence. I am older than you, I made you what you are. You transformed my body, Alaric agreed. But you never touched my soul. Marcus knew that, Seraphina knew that, and now, thanks to this brave little girl, he gestured toward Elara, who was watching with wide eyes, I know it too. He turned his back on Verk, a gesture of absolute contempt. absolute trust that his enemy would not strike, and walked toward his granddaughter. He knelt in the mud before her, bringing himself to her eye level, ignoring the rain that had begun to fall again. Elara, he said softly, I need to tell you something that will be difficult to understand, but you deserve the truth. You have shown more courage this morning than warriors twice your size. The little girl wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Are you really a vampire? Oh, yes. Are you going to hurt people's? No, he reached out and gently took her small hand in his cold one. I made that choice a long time ago, and I make it again now. I will never hurt innocent people. I will never become the monster that others expect me to be. Alara studied his face with that old soul wisdom that seemed to look straight through him. My papa said the wolf remembers. He said when I found you, I should ask you what that means. Alaric felt tears burning in his ancient eyes, tears he had not shed in centuries, tears he had believed himself incapable of producing. It means that I remember love, he said, his voice breaking. It means that no matter what they did to me, no matter how they tried to destroy my humanity, the wolf, the protector, the guardian, always remembered why it fights. It fights for family. It fights for the innocent. It fights for the people it loves. Oh, he squeezed her hand gently. Elara, I am your great-great-great-grandfather. Your father was descended from my son, Cassian, who lived and married and had children of his own because a brave man named Marcus protected my family across generations. Everything your papa did, everything the Ashwood family has done for 200 years, it was all to preserve a bloodline that connects us. You and I are family. Alara's eyes went wide. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, processing this impossible information. Then, very slowly, she reached out and touched his face, tracing the lines around his eyes, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the evidence of centuries written in his features. Oh, you look sad, she said finally. Despite everything, Alaric laughed, a broken, wet, wonderful sound. I have been sad for a very long time, but I think I might be ready to stop. Behind them, Verk made his move. The ancient vampire had used the distraction to gather his remaining soldiers, and now he struck with all the speed and savagery his kind was capable of. But he had forgotten something crucial, something that 300 years of manipulation had blinded him to. Alaric was not alone. From the shadows of the refugee quarter emerged the people Alaric had protected, vampires and humans alike, united by centuries of just rule and genuine compassion. His generals appeared first, moving with supernatural speed to intercept Verk's attack. Then came the human refugees themselves, armed with whatever they could find, forming a protective circle around their king and the little girl he held. They should have been enemies. Vampires and humans, creatures of darkness and beings of daylight, everything in their nature should have placed them on opposite sides. But Alaric had spent 3 centuries proving that nature could be overcome. He had built a kingdom where both kinds could coexist, where power was tempered by mercy, where strength meant protection rather than domination. And now that kingdom rose to defend him. The battle was brief and decisive. Verk, for all his centuries of scheming, had never understood the one thing that made Alaric truly powerful. Not his supernatural abilities, not his ancient bloodline, but the loyalty he inspired in those he served. Within minutes, Verk was surrounded. His soldiers had been disarmed without serious injury. Alaric's standing orders regarding prisoners remained in effect even in chaos. The ancient vampire lord stood alone in the center of the square, his amber eyes darting around in search of escape, finding none. You could still join me, Alaric said, stepping forward. 300 years we have worked side by side. I would rather believe that somewhere in you there is still something worth saving. Verk's face twisted with contempt. You understand nothing. You could have been a god. You could have ruled the entire world. Instead, you choose to play nursemaid to mortals who will die within the blink of an immortal eye. Alaric looked back at Elara, who was being held protectively by a group of refugees, humans who had only known her for days but were willing to stand against vampires to keep her safe. Those mortals, Alaric said, have taught me more about strength than centuries of immortality ever did. They love knowing they will lose. They hope knowing they will be disappointed. They build knowing their works will eventually crumble. And yet they continue. They endure. They pass on what matters to the next generation and the next and the next. Well, he turned back to Verk. You tried to make me forget what it means to be human. You failed. And now you will spend eternity remembering what you could never understand. The exile of Lord Verk was carried out with the same justice that had characterized Alaric's reign. No execution, no torture, simply banishment to the frozen wastes of the northern territories with a mark upon him that would alert every vampire in the known world to his crimes. He would survive, immortals always did, but he would never again wield power over others. Some of Alaric's council questioned the mercy. Verk had manipulated their king for 3 centuries, had murdered innocents across generations, had nearly destroyed everything Alaric held dear. But Alaric understood something his advisors did not. Revenge and justice were not the same thing. Killing Verk would have been satisfying, but it would have proven his manipulation successful. It would have shown that Alaric could be pushed into becoming the creature Verk had always wanted him to be. The choice to spare him was the final rejection of everything Verk represented. 1 year later, the eastern quarter of the capital had been transformed completely. What had once been abandoned merchant houses now formed a thriving community where humans and vampires lived side by side. Alaric had ordered the construction of schools and hospitals, markets and gardens, all the trappings of a real neighborhood, not just a refugee camp. And in the heart of it all, in a small house with flowers in the windows and a view of the sunrise, lived the king's family. Alaric visited every evening just after sunset. He would walk through the streets without disguise now, greeting merchants and children, pausing to resolve disputes or simply to listen to the stories of those who called this place home. The terror that had once surrounded his name was fading, replaced by something he had never expected to feel: affection. They called him the Old Wolf now, a nickname Elara had invented and which had spread through the kingdom with remarkable speed. He pretended to find it undignified, but everyone knew better. Everyone had seen the way the fearsome vampire king smiled when he heard it. On this particular evening, Alaric found Elara in the small garden behind her house, carefully tending to a plot of flowers she had planted in memory of her father. She was nearly 7 now, and she had grown in the year since their first meeting, not just in height but in confidence. The quiet, grief-stricken child who had sat alone while others played was gone, replaced by a curious, adventurous girl who had become the unofficial mascot of the refugee community. "The roses are blooming," she said without turning around, somehow always knowing when he arrived. Papa would have loved them. He always said red roses were Mama's favorite. Alaric sat down on the bench beside the garden, watching her work. "Tell me about your mother." It was a question he asked often. Alara's mother had died when she was very young, a fever that had swept through their village before they fled, and Alaric had learned that keeping memories alive was one of the most important things he could do for his granddaughter. "She had green eyes like mine," Elara said. "Papa said she got them from his grandmother, who got them from her grandmother, who got them from someone very old and very important." She glanced at Alaric with a knowing smile. "I think he meant you." "I think he did too," Alaric agreed. Elara finished with the roses and came to sit beside him, automatically leaning into his side. The first time she had done this, Alaric had been so startled by the casual intimacy that he had frozen completely. Now it was the most natural thing in the world. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "Do you ever regret it, becoming a vampire, losing your family?" It was the kind of question that should have been too heavy for a child to ask and too painful for an immortal to answer. But Elara had never been an ordinary child, and Alaric had finally learned to stop hiding from the truth. "Every day," he said quietly, "every single day for 300 years, I have regretted the moment I lost Serafina and Cassian. I have wondered what our lives would have been if I had protected them better, if I had been stronger, if I had been more careful." He looked down at her, this small, miraculous girl who carried his blood and his legacy. But then I think about Marcus and everything he sacrificed to preserve what I had lost. I think about your father and his father before him and all the generations who carried the wolf's mark across centuries. I think about how their courage and love brought us to this moment, you and me, sitting in this garden watching roses bloom. Alaric's voice softened, and I realized that I was never truly alone. Even when I forgot, even when the memories were stolen from me, my family was out there, living, growing, loving, passing on the things that mattered to each new generation. The wolf remembered even when the king forgot. Elara considered this for a long moment. I'm glad you found me, she said finally. I was really scared when Papa died. I thought I was all alone. But then you came, and now I have a great-great-great-grandfather who is also a king, and that's pretty cool. Alaric laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, the kind that he had forgotten he was capable of producing. Pretty cool indeed. That night, after Elara had gone to sleep and Alaric had returned to his castle, he stood once again at the window of his highest tower. But this time, his eyes were not fixed on the darkness. They were watching the lights of the eastern quarter, the small fires and candles that marked the lives of the people he had sworn to protect. Somewhere in those lights was his granddaughter, dreaming whatever dreams a 7-year-old dreams. Dreams of flowers and adventures and maybe, sometimes, of old wolves and kind monsters. His advisor, a new one carefully chosen, one who had been recommended by the refugee community itself, approached quietly. Your Majesty, the Council wishes to discuss the expansion of the Harbor District. Tell them it can wait until tomorrow. Very well, is there anything else you require? Alaric shook his head. Only this view, only this moment. The advisor withdrew, and the vampire king stood alone with his thoughts. 300 years of loneliness had ended with a child's whisper and a father's final message. 300 years of believing he was beyond redemption had been shattered by a little girl who saw the man behind the monster and refused to be afraid. The wolf remembers. He understood now what Marcus had truly meant by those words. It was not just about memories of a human past. It was about the core of who he was, the protector, the guardian, the creature who fought for family no matter what form that family took. The wolf remembered, and the wolf would never forget again. In the years that followed, the kingdom of Valdren became something unprecedented. A realm where vampires and humans truly lived as equals, where ancient power was tempered by genuine compassion, where the terrible king in his dark castle was also a grandfather who attended school plays and taught a little girl how to dance. Stories spread across the land, not of a fearsome monster, but of the old wolf and his unlikely family. Refugees from a dozen nations found safety within his borders. Children who had grown up on tales of vampire horrors discovered that monsters could choose to be kind. And slowly, carefully, the world began to change. Not because of magic or conquest or supernatural power, but because one immortal had remembered what it meant to love. And in her small house in the eastern quarter, surrounded by red roses that bloomed year after year in defiance of every winter, Elara Ashwood grew into a young woman who would one day lead that kingdom alongside her grandfather. But that is a story for another time. For now, it is enough to know this. The wolf remembered and in remembering found its way home.